The sun was setting over the bustling streets of Chicago, casting long shadows across the city. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee as he scanned the area. It had been a quiet shift so far, too quiet for his liking. Mark wasn't one to enjoy calm days. They'd made him restless. He preferred action, something to keep his mind occupied. But tonight, the universe seemed determined to give him just that. As he turned onto a quieter street lined with tall buildings and dimly lit shops, a black SUV caught his attention. The vehicle swerved slightly before straightening out, its tires brushing against the lane divider. To most people, it might have looked like an innocent mistake, a distracted driver or someone adjusting their radio. But Mark's instincts kicked in immediately. "That's careless driving," he muttered under his breath, flicking on his sirens. The SUV slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. Mark stepped out of his car, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached the driver's side window. Behind the wheel sat a woman with smooth brown skin, her hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She wore a plain jacket and jeans, looking more like someone running errands than someone up to no good. Still, there was something about her demeanor that made Mark uneasy. "License and registration, please," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd worn the badge for years. The woman nodded calmly and reached into her glove compartment. Her movements were deliberate, but Mark noticed how tightly she gripped the documents before handing them over. He glanced at her license. "Elena Carter." He read aloud, then looked up at her face. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "I think I drifted a little," Elena replied, her tone polite but measured. "It was unintentional. I'm sorry." Mark studied her expression carefully. Most people would be nervous during a traffic stop, but Elena seemed different. Not scared, not overly apologetic. Just calm. Too calm, maybe. His eyes drifted toward the interior of the car. On the passenger seat lay a sleek leather bag, partially unzipped. From this angle, he couldn't see inside, but his curiosity grew. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" Mark asked casually, leaning slightly closer to get a better view of the car. "I'm visiting a friend nearby," Elena answered without hesitation. Her gaze met his briefly before returning to the steering wheel. There was nothing suspicious about her answer, yet something still didn't sit right with Mark. Maybe it was the expensive SUV she drove, or the way she carried herself. Confident, almost too composed for someone being questioned by the police. Mark decided to dig deeper. "Can you step out of the vehicle, ma'am?" he requested, his tone firmer now. Elena hesitated for a split second before complying. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Mark's eyes landed on the bulge beneath her jacket. His pulse quickened. "Was that a gun?" "What's that?" he demanded, pointing to her side. Elena followed his gaze and sighed softly, as if she'd expected this moment all along. "It's my firearm," she said evenly. "I have a permit." Mark froze. A concealed weapon. This wasn't adding up. Something about this woman felt off, and his training told him not to ignore his gut feeling. Little did he know, his next move would change both their lives forever. And not in the way he expected. Mark's mind raced as he processed Elena's admission about the firearm. His training kicked in, but so did his biases. The combination of her calm demeanor, the expensive SUV, and now a concealed weapon painted a picture in his head, one that screamed trouble. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong here. To him, this wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. It felt like a potential threat. "Hands where I can see them," Mark barked, stepping back slightly to create distance between them. Elena raised her hand slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't look scared or defiant, just resigned, as if she'd been through this before. "Officer," she said evenly, "I'm not who you think I am." But Mark wasn't listening. His focus narrowed to the task at hand, ensuring his safety and following protocol. He ordered her to turn around and place her hands on the hood of the car. As he moved to handcuff her, Elena spoke again, her voice firmer this time. "You're making a mistake. I'm law enforcement." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut, but skepticism clouded his judgment. Law enforcement. Him. A cop with years of experience failing to recognize another officer. It seemed impossible, or worse, like a desperate lie meant to throw him off. "Save it for the station," he snapped, tightening the cuffs around her wrists. By now, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. People whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Flashing lights from Mark's patrol car illuminated the area, casting eerie shadows across Elena's face as she stood there, restrained and silent. Her eyes scanned the growing audience, lingering briefly on one person holding a phone steady in her direction. If anyone noticed the frustration simmering beneath her composed exterior, they didn't show it. Back at the car, Mark began searching the interior more thoroughly. Inside the leather bag on the passenger seat, he found what looked like official documents, papers filled with notes, maps marked with locations, and even photographs of individuals he didn't recognize. None of it made sense to him. Then came the trunk. When he popped it open, his breath caught in his throat. Stacks of cash wrapped in rubber bands sat neatly inside, along with what appeared to be surveillance equipment. His heart pounded as he stared at the items. This wasn't adding up to anything legal in his mind. Cash, weapons, mysterious documents. It all pointed to criminal activity. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, a tiny voice in the back of his head whispered doubt. Why would someone involved in something shady remain so calm? Why hadn't she tried to run or resist? Still, pride and procedure overruled his hesitation. Mark slammed the trunk shut and walked back to Elena, who stood silently by his patrol car. "You've got some explaining to do," he said gruffly, opening the door and guiding her into the backseat. As he closed the door behind her, he caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. For the first time since the stop, her mask of composure cracked slightly. There was a flicker of anger, or maybe disappointment, in her eyes. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Elena leaned her head back against the seat, exhaling slowly. She knew exactly how bad this looked. Every second wasted in custody put her mission at risk, and the people she was trying to bring down might slip through her fingers. But she also knew that panicking wouldn't help. Instead, she focused on staying calm, trusting that her team would realize something was wrong soon enough. Meanwhile, Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, replaying the events in his head. Something about this entire situation gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Was he missing something obvious, or was he letting his own assumptions cloud his judgment? Either way, one thing was certain. This case was far from over, and neither of them could predict the storm brewing ahead. At the precinct, Elena sat quietly in an interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table in front of her. The cold metal chair pressed uncomfortably against her back, but she didn't complain. Instead, she kept her focus sharp, her mind racing through possible ways to salvage the situation. She knew better than to say too much. Her cover was still intact, at least for now. But every minute she spent locked up was a minute the drug ring could use to slip away. Detective Mark Reynolds entered the room, carrying a folder with him. He slid it onto the table and took a seat across from her. His expression was hard, his eyes fixed on hers as if trying to read her thoughts. "All right," he began, leaning forward slightly. "Let's start from the beginning. Who are you really, and what were you doing with all that cash?" Elena met his gaze calmly, her voice steady. "I already told you. I'm law enforcement. You're wasting time here when you should be helping me." Mark frowned, clearly unimpressed. "If you're really who you say you are, prove it. Give me something concrete." "I can't," Elena replied firmly. "Not without jeopardizing my operation. If you want answers, contact Agent Harris with the FBI. He'll confirm everything." The name meant nothing to Mark. To him, it sounded like another attempt to deflect suspicion. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, I've seen this before. People claiming they're working undercover or part of some big sting operation. It's always the same story when they're caught red-handed. Elena sighed softly, frustration creeping into her tone. This isn't a game, officer. What I'm involved in is bigger than you realize, and if you don't act soon, innocent lives will be at risk. But Mark wasn't swayed. He had evidence staring him in the face. Stacks of cash, surveillance gear, and a firearm. None of it pointed to someone working for the good guys. Innocent lives. That's rich coming from someone hauling around enough money to buy half this block. As the standoff continued, tension thickened in the air. Mark scribbled notes in his folder while Elena remained silent, her patience wearing thin. Outside the interrogation room, other officers whispered among themselves, speculating about the mysterious woman brought in by Reynolds. Some thought she was guilty. Others weren't so sure. Either way, the arrest had become the talk of the station. Meanwhile, miles away, Agent Harris glanced at his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Elena was supposed to check in hours ago, but her phone went straight to voicemail. At first, he assumed she was busy tailing a lead or lying low, but as the silence stretched on, concern began to creep in. Something wasn't right. Harris picked up his phone and dialed her number again, pacing his office as it rang unanswered. Then, deciding not to wait any longer, he called one of their trusted informants, a street-level source who often provided tips. Within minutes, he learned about the traffic stop and subsequent arrest. The informant even sent him grainy footage of the scene captured by bystanders. Agent Harris froze as he watched the video. There was no mistaking Elena being handcuffed and placed into the patrol car. Anger surged through him, not just at the officers who detained her, but at himself for not foreseeing this possibility. Undercover work was dangerous, especially for agents like Elena, whose appearance often led to unfair assumptions. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, already dialing contacts within the department to demand answers. Back at the precinct, Elena stared at the two-way mirror on the wall, wondering how long it would take for her team to find her. She couldn't afford to lose momentum on the case, not after months of painstaking work. Every second counted, and every delay brought the drug ring closer to disappearing forever. For Mark, however, the puzzle only grew more complicated. Despite his certainty that Elena was hiding something, there was an unsettling feeling gnawing at him, a quiet voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a mistake. But admitting that meant confronting uncomfortable truths about himself, ones he wasn't ready to face yet. Little did he know, those truths were about to come crashing down on him sooner than expected. Mark sat at his desk, flipping through the contents of the folder he'd compiled during Elena's arrest. The evidence seemed damning. Stacks of cash bundled neatly in the trunk, a firearm with a concealed carry permit that raised more questions than it answered, and a burner phone filled with cryptic text messages. Each piece pointed to criminal activity, or so it appeared on the surface. Yet, as Mark stared at the items laid out before him, something didn't sit right. The cash was peculiar. It wasn't dirty or crumpled like money typically associated with illegal dealings. Instead, it looked crisp and organized, almost as if it had been prepared for a specific purpose. The surveillance equipment found alongside it included high-end cameras and listening devices, tools far beyond what an ordinary person would need. Even the maps in Elena's bag were marked with precise locations, complete with timestamps and handwritten notes. This wasn't the work of someone acting alone. It was meticulous, professional. Then there was her demeanor. Most people brought into custody showed signs of panic, anger, or desperation. But Elena, she remained eerily calm throughout the entire process, refusing to divulge details while insisting she was law enforcement. Her confidence unsettled Mark. Was she simply a skilled liar, or was there truth to her claims? He glanced over at the interrogation room, where Elena still sat patiently, waiting for answers that weren't coming. For a moment, doubt flickered in his mind. What if she really was undercover? What if arresting her had disrupted something bigger than he could comprehend? He shook his head, trying to push those thoughts aside. No, he told himself. The evidence was clear. His instincts rarely failed him, and they were screaming that something here was off. But then again, his instincts had also led him to misjudge situations before. Memories of past cases surfaced, times when he'd jumped to conclusions only to discover later that he'd been wrong. Those moments haunted him, reminders of how easy it was to let biases cloud judgment. Could this be one of those times? As Mark wrestled with his thoughts, Agent Harris arrived at the precinct, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in a sharp suit, he strode up to the front desk and demanded to speak with whoever was handling Elena Carter's case. When Mark approached, Harris wasted no time cutting to the chase. "Where is she?" he asked sharply, his voice laced with authority. "And why is she being held?" Mark hesitated, taken aback by Harris's intensity. "She's under investigation," he replied cautiously. "We found evidence linking her to suspicious activities." Harris' expression darkened. "Suspicious? Let me make this very clear, officer. That woman is Detective Elena Carter, an undercover FBI agent working on a major drug trafficking operation. Your arrest has not only compromised her safety, but potentially endangered months of investigative work." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned as Harris handed over official documentation, proving Elena's identity and detailing her assignment. As Mark scanned the papers, his heart sank. Every detail matched what he'd observed: the expensive SUV, the surveillance gear, even the cash. None of it was illegal. It was all part of her cover. For a moment, the world around him seemed to blur. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He thought back to the traffic stop, replaying every interaction with Elena. Her calmness, her insistence that she was law enforcement. It all made sense now. But understanding didn't erase the damage already done. Agent Harris watched Mark closely, gauging his reaction. "You've put her life in danger," he said finally, his tone softer but no less serious. "And you've jeopardized an operation that could dismantle one of the largest drug rings in the city. Do you understand what that means?" Mark nodded slowly, shame washing over him. He realized now that this wasn't just about evidence or protocol. It was about trust, accountability, and the consequences of letting bias dictate actions. As Harris stormed off to retrieve Elena, Mark was left standing alone, grappling with the realization that his choices had ripple effects far beyond what he'd ever imagined. And for the first time in years, he felt truly unsure of himself. The atmosphere in the precinct shifted dramatically as Agent Harris marched through the halls, his presence commanding respect and urgency. Officers who had been casually chatting moments earlier now fell silent, watching him with a mix of curiosity and unease. He didn't stop to exchange pleasantries or explain himself. His focus was singular: getting Elena out of custody and back to work before any further damage could be done. When Harris entered the interrogation room, where Elena sat cuffed to the table, her expression softened slightly at the sight of him. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. "Took you long enough," she said dryly, though there was no real anger in her voice. She trusted Harris implicitly, knowing he wouldn't rest until she was free. Harris gave her a tight smile, pulling out a set of keys to unlock the handcuffs. "Sorry about that," he replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Let's get you out of here." As they stepped into the hallway, Mark stood nearby, visibly uneasy. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and his shoulders were hunched as if bracing for impact. When Harris spotted him, he stopped abruptly, turning to face the officer with an intensity that made Mark instinctively take a step back. "This is Detective Elena Carter," Harris announced loudly enough for nearby officers to hear. "She's one of ours, an undercover FBI agent working on a critical operation targeting a major drug trafficking ring. Your actions tonight have put her life at risk and jeopardized months of painstaking work." His voice was calm but carried an edge, sharp enough to cut steel. Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes now fixed on him. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The evidence. The evidence. Harris interrupted, his tone rising slightly. You mean the cash, the surveillance equipment, and the firearm. All tools necessary for her assignment. Did it ever occur to you to verify her claims instead of jumping to conclusions? Mark opened his mouth to respond but found no words. The truth was, Harris was right. He'd acted on impulse, letting his assumptions guide his decisions without taking the time to dig deeper. Now, standing face to face with the consequences of his actions, he felt smaller than he ever had in his career. Elena stepped forward, drawing Harris' attention. It's fine, she said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. We don't have time for this. Every second we waste arguing puts the mission further at risk. Harris hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Turning back to Mark, he added, This isn't over. You'll hear from our department about this incident, and I expect full cooperation moving forward. Understood? Yes, sir, Mark replied, his voice heavy with regret. He watched as Harris escorted Elena toward the exit, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. As the door closed behind them, the precinct fell eerily quiet, the gravity of what had just happened settling over everyone present. Alone with his thoughts, Mark leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. The image of Elena's calm yet disappointed expression replayed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd let her down, not just as a fellow law enforcement officer, but as a human being. Her professionalism during the ordeal only highlighted how poorly he'd handled the situation. Later that evening, Mark sat in his car outside the precinct, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting shadows across his face. For the first time in years, he questioned whether he was truly cut out for this job. Was he too quick to judge, too blinded by his own biases? These questions swirled in his mind, leaving him restless and unsure of what came next. Meanwhile, Elena climbed into Harris's car, exhaling deeply as she sank into the seat. That could have gone worse, she muttered, half-jokingly. Harris glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. Don't even start, he warned lightly. You're lucky things didn't escalate further. Elena nodded, her humor fading as reality set in. Her cover might still be intact, but the disruption caused by Mark's mistake had cost her valuable time. The drug ring wasn't going to wait around while she cleaned up the mess. As Harris drove them away from the precinct, Elena stared out the window, her jaw tightening with determination. There was no room for error now. She'd have to move faster, smarter, and harder than ever before, and hope that justice would prevail despite the setbacks. The days following the incident weighed heavily on Mark Reynolds. He couldn't shake the image of Elena Carter, her calm, composed demeanor during the arrest, and the quiet disappointment in her eyes when Agent Harris revealed her true identity. It wasn't just guilt gnawing at him, it was shame. Shame for letting his biases dictate his actions, for failing to see beyond the surface, and for potentially endangering someone who was risking her life to protect others. At first, he tried to bury himself in work, hoping the routine of patrols and paperwork would distract him. But every time he pulled someone over or questioned a civilian, Elena's face flashed in his mind. What if he made another mistake? What if his assumptions cost someone else their freedom, or worse, their life? The thought kept him up at night, replaying scenarios in his head where things could have gone terribly wrong. His captain noticed the change in him almost immediately. "You've been off lately," Captain Dawson remarked one afternoon as they reviewed case files together. "Something on your mind?" Mark hesitated, debating whether to open up. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's about that arrest last week, the undercover FBI agent I detained." Dawson raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Mark continued, his voice tinged with frustration. "I messed up, sir. I let my assumptions get the better of me. And now, well, I don't even know how much damage I caused." To his surprise, Dawson nodded understandingly. "Mistakes happen, Reynolds. But what matters is what you do after them. Are you learning from this?" Mark looked down at his hands, thinking carefully before responding. I think so. I mean, I've realized how easy it is to jump to conclusions based on appearances. He paused, searching for the right words. I need to be better, not just for myself, but for the people I'm supposed to serve. Dawson gave him a small, approving nod. Good. Start by owning your mistake. Apologize when you can, and take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's how you rebuild trust. Taking his captain's advice to heart, Mark requested permission to attend sensitivity training sessions offered by the department. These workshops focused on addressing implicit biases, improving communication skills, and fostering stronger relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. At first, Mark felt out of place among colleagues who seemed more eager to participate than he did. But as the sessions progressed, he began to see patterns in his behavior, patterns he hadn't noticed before. One exercise stood out to him in particular. Participants were asked to pair up and share personal stories about times they'd felt misunderstood or unfairly judged. Listening to his partner recount experiences of racial profiling hit Mark hard. For the first time, he saw the human impact of such actions, not just statistics or headlines, but real lives affected by mistrust and prejudice. Outside of work, Mark sought mentorship from veteran officers known for their community-focused approach. One of them, Officer Linda Vega, became a guiding figure for him. Over coffee, she shared stories of her own struggles with bias early in her career and how she worked to overcome them. It's not about being perfect, she told him one evening. It's about being willing to grow. People will forgive mistakes if they see you're genuinely trying to improve. Meanwhile, Alina returned to the field, determined to salvage her mission despite the setback. Her handler, Agent Harris, insisted she lay low for a few days to ensure her cover remained intact. During that time, Alina reflected on the incident with Mark. While she understood systemic issues within policing all too well, she also recognized the importance of accountability and growth. If Mark truly wanted to change, she decided to give him the chance to prove it. When Mark finally reached out to apologize formally, Alina listened without interrupting. His words were sincere, filled with regret and a desire to do better. Though she remained guarded, she acknowledged his effort. "Thank you for apologizing," she said simply. "Just remember, it's not enough to say sorry. You have to act differently moving forward." Her response stayed with Mark long after their conversation ended. It wasn't forgiveness he sought, but redemption. And though the road ahead would be challenging, he knew one thing for certain. He owed it to Alina, to his badge, and to himself to try. Weeks turned into months, and both Mark Reynolds and Alina Carter found themselves navigating the aftermath of their encounter in deeply personal ways. For Mark, every day became an opportunity to challenge his own biases and improve as an officer and as a person. He threw himself into community outreach programs, attending town hall meetings and neighborhood events where residents voiced concerns about policing practices. At first, stepping into these spaces felt uncomfortable. Some attendees eyed him with suspicion, their distrust evident in crossed arms and sharp questions. But instead of retreating, Mark leaned in, listening intently and responding honestly. One evening, during a discussion at a local community center, a young woman stood up and addressed him directly. "How do we know you're not just saying what we want to hear?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. "What's stopping you from going back to old habits once this meeting is over?" Mark hesitated, feeling the weight of her question. He knew he couldn't erase years of systemic issues overnight, or even guarantee that he wouldn't make mistakes again. But he owed her honesty. "You're right," he admitted. "I can't promise perfection, but I can promise effort. If you see me slipping, call me out. Hold me accountable." The room fell silent for a moment before murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start, a small step toward rebuilding trust. Over time, Mark began forming connections with people who had once viewed him with skepticism. They saw his willingness to listen and learn, and while some remained cautious, Others started opening up, sharing stories and perspectives that broadened his understanding of the community he served. For Elena, life returned to its high-stakes rhythm. The drug trafficking case she'd been working on took a dramatic turn when one of her key informants provided critical information about an upcoming shipment. With renewed focus, she dove back into her undercover role, determined to bring the operation to a close despite the earlier disruption caused by Mark's arrest. Her handler, Agent Harris, kept a close eye on her, ensuring she had backup whenever necessary. Still, the memory of that night lingered in the back of her mind, a reminder of how fragile undercover work could be. Despite her guarded nature, Elena couldn't deny that Mark's apology had left an impression on her. She didn't expect perfection from anyone, least of all someone entrenched in a system riddled with flaws, but she appreciated his sincerity. As weeks passed, she occasionally wondered whether he was truly changing or simply putting on a show. Only time would tell. Then came the unexpected twist, a community outreach event organized jointly by the police department and local advocacy groups. The goal was simple: to foster dialogue and collaboration between law enforcement and civilians. When Elena arrived, she hadn't planned to stay long. She figured it would be another routine gathering filled with polite conversations and vague promises. But as she wandered through the crowd, she spotted a familiar face: Mark Reynolds. He recognized her immediately and approached cautiously, clearly unsure of how she'd react. "Detective Carter," he said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you." Elena hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Officer Reynolds," she replied evenly. "What brings you here?" "I'm trying to do better," he admitted, glancing around at the bustling event. "This is part of that." Elena studied him carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. Instead, she found something else: vulnerability. Here was a man who had made a grave mistake, but was actively working to correct it, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. "I'll admit," she said after a pause, "you've surprised me. Keep doing what you're doing, and maybe someday people will believe you've changed." Her words weren't exactly praise, but they carried a note of encouragement, one Mark desperately needed. As they parted ways, each returning to their respective missions, there was a subtle shift in the air. Neither walked away fully trusting the other, but both acknowledged the possibility of growth. In a world often divided by mistrust and misunderstanding, that acknowledgement was no small thing. And though their paths might never cross again, the ripple effects of their shared experience continued to shape them, reminding them that redemption, however imperfect, was always within reach if they were willing to fight for it. Months later, the city of Chicago buzzed with news that sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the criminal underworld. Elena Carter's relentless pursuit of justice finally paid off when she led a massive FBI raid that dismantled one of the largest drug trafficking rings in the region. The operation was executed flawlessly, thanks to months of careful planning, strategic teamwork, and Elena's unwavering determination. Dozens of arrests were made, shipments worth millions were seized, and countless lives were spared from the devastating effects of addiction and violence. The success of the mission earned Elena widespread recognition within the Bureau. Her colleagues celebrated her tenacity and resourcefulness, while Agent Harris proudly declared her one of the best undercover operatives he'd ever worked with. Yet, despite the accolades, Elena remained humble. For her, this wasn't about personal glory. It was about making a difference. As she stood outside the courthouse watching suspects being led away in handcuffs, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds continued his journey of self-improvement, though progress came slowly. He faced criticism from some peers who dismissed his efforts as performative, while others quietly respected his willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Despite the mixed reactions, Mark stayed committed to change. His involvement in community programs grew, and he became a familiar face at local events. Residents began to see him less as an authority figure and more as someone genuinely invested in their well-being. It was during one such event, a charity fundraiser for youth mentorship programs, that fate brought Mark and Elena together once again. The venue was bustling with people, laughter filling the air as attendees mingled over food and music. Mark spotted Elena across the room, her presence unmistakable even in casual attire. Hesitant but determined, he approached her. "Detective Carter," he said, offering a polite smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." Elena turned, surprised but not displeased to find him standing there. "Officer Reynolds," she replied with a nod. "Small world, isn't it?" They exchanged pleasantries, discussing the evening's purpose and the importance of supporting young people in underserved communities. Eventually, the conversation shifted to their shared history. Mark took a deep breath before speaking. "I heard about your case. Congratulations on taking down that ring. You did incredible work." Elena studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, especially after everything. But we got there." Mark winced slightly at the reminder of his role in nearly derailing her mission. "I know I can't undo what happened," he said earnestly, "but I hope my actions since then have shown you I'm serious about doing better." To his relief, Elena softened. "They have," she admitted. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and trust takes time. But I've seen enough to believe you're heading in the right direction." Her words carried weight, and Mark felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Though their encounter was brief, it marked a turning point, not just for them individually, but for the broader relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. By choosing accountability over defensiveness, growth over stagnation, they had proven that even the most fractured connections could begin to heal. As the night drew to a close, Mark watched Elena leave, her silhouette disappearing into the crowd. He returned to his table, reflecting on how far he'd come, and how much farther he still had to go. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that redemption was possible, that bridges could be rebuilt, and that every small step toward understanding mattered. In the end, their story wasn't just about mistakes or triumphs. It was about resilience, about two individuals navigating the complexities of justice, bias, and humanity, each striving to leave the world a little better than they found it. And as the lights dimmed on that charity gala, the ripple effects of their choices continued to spread, quietly shaping the future in ways neither could fully anticipate.